Good morning. Welcome to Polar Bears International's Tundra Connections program. And it's polar bear season in Churchill. We're sitting here on Tundra Buggy 1 live. And sorry for the 2-minute delay, but this is the tundra. We've got Arctic winds and polar bears outside. And I'm Don Moore. Roche, and we'll get into introductions here in a minute. Today we're going to be learning about bears in our changing world. We'll talk about the 8 bear species that live today on planet Earth, how the climate is changing and affecting our world and bear habitats, and how human-bear relations may change because of this. Our target audience today includes classrooms and people from all across the country. Our partners on today's program are Explore.org and members of the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, Arctic Ambassador Zoos and Aquariums. This program will last about 50 minutes, including time for questions and answers. We'll also talk about how you can help polar bears and other bears and our planet, and we'd love to hear about what all of you are doing to increase your conservation actions. Today you can submit questions through a chat window. Email your questions to questions@pbears.org, and we'll share them during the webcast. For example, if your school uses power strips to save energy or compost its cafeteria waste, you can even send in those actions, and we'll try to share those. You can also send questions to Twitter at #TundraConnections. So, who are we and why are we here? Again, I'm Don Moore. I'm with Smithsonian Institution and also Association of Zoos and Aquariums, and I've been working with bears since I was about 8 years old. I have a passion for polar bears, and I'll be moderating today's session. I'm going to turn to my right and Dr. Cecilia Bitts and ask you to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Cecilia Bitts from University of Washington Atmospheric Sciences, and my work is on the role of sea ice in the climate system and climate change in general. I am an instructor at University of Washington, and I do research as well. I'm very deeply interested in how polar bears interact with the sea ice and the role of the changing sea ice on polar bears.
Dr. Megan Owen.
I'm Megan Owen, and I'm from the San Diego Zoo Institute for Conservation Research. I've been studying bears for about the past 17 years, and I'm very lucky that I get to focus on a range of bear species. We study giant pandas, polar bears, and every bear species in between. Generally speaking, I focus on their behavioral ecology, but most importantly, we're focused on understanding the biology of the bears in ways that are best suited towards learning these things in a captive setting in a zoo or a rescue facility, and applying what we learn to conservation of wild bears.
And Dr. Andrew DeRoche.
Well, good morning. My name is Andrew DeRoche. I teach at the University of Alberta. I'm a professor there. I've been studying polar bears across the Arctic for about 30 years now. It's my primary research species. It's the one I work on the most, but we also do some work on other Arctic species in my research group. We study caribou and peregrine falcons, Arctic wolves, and grizzly bears. So I think we'll get started today.
Sure. So again, we're on the tundra just outside the town of Churchill, Manitoba, which is a town like many others. It's got about 900 people, and from June until November, the biggest difference in this town is the risk of polar bears coming into town as the polar bears kind of mass around Churchill and the local area on the shore of the Hudson's Bay, waiting for the ice to come in. We drove out here on a Tundra buggy. This is buggy number 1. It's a rolling TV studio, and we've been, active on Tundra buggy 1 for years now, bringing you webinars and chats to other places in the world. So let's get busy here and talk about the 8 species of bears that live in our world today. Megan, how are bears related to one another and to other carnivores? Can you talk about that?
So as Don said, there are 8 species of bear in the world, and they're a really incredible, interesting, unique family of animals because it's a relatively small family, but there is a very, very broad ecology represented amongst the bear species. Sadly, 7 of 8 bear species are conservation dependent, from giant pandas, which are critically endangered, sun bears, Asiatic black bears, which we really know very little about, but are really under a lot of pressure in their home range, Andean bears, sloth bears, and of course black bears in the United States, in North America, and brown bears. And what makes bears, one of the things that makes bears so susceptible to human activity is that they require a lot of space and a lot of resources, and there are a lot of people, and that tends to pose problems for bear species.
Okay. And Dr. DeRoche, could you tell us a little bit about your history in studying bears, and maybe speak specifically to the North American bears, the polar bear and grizzly bear, because everybody's interested in how they're related and how their ecology is similar and different.
Well, in North America, we have 3 species of bears. We have the very widespread black bear, which is what we call Ursus americanus, and then we have the grizzly bear. Sometimes you'll hear the term brown bear. A brown bear and a grizzly bear are the same species, and that's Ursus arctos. And then, of course, where we are here, the bear right around us is the polar bear, and that's Ursus maritimus, the sea bear. And these 3 species are all in the same genus, so they still all belong to the same family. It's quite interesting because polar bears and grizzly bears are very closely related, and we actually have some hybrids in the Canadian Arctic right now, and at various times in the past, these 2 species, although we consider them good species, they're quite different. I mean, everybody knows when they're looking at a polar bear versus a grizzly bear, but they can get together and create hybrids. We're not sure how effective it is when you're a hybrid polar bear or grizzly bear cross, but it's an interesting phenomenon, and it's something that we're certainly interested in. When we think about evolution, we always sort of look at those pictures like we showed earlier of all these nice, clean evolution, and this species branches off and comes here. But in reality, evolution is a pretty messy process, and during this separation period, sometimes the 2 potential species get back together and hybridize, and they come together and back and forth, and we know this has been going on for a long period of time. So it's they're very distinctly different life histories. Black bears quite often have 3 cubs, sometimes 4. Grizzly bears usually 2 to 3, sometimes 4, but a few less. Polar bears pretty much 2 cubs, 1 cub. Rarely do we see triplets. We used to see a lot more triplets in this area. It's the only area in the polar bear distribution where triplets were common. But it seems like the ecological conditions here have slipped enough that now pretty much 1 or 2 cubs is the rule. So their life histories are different in terms of their reproductive history, but also, of course, in their diet. And one of the things you can look at is the black bear and the grizzly bear are what we would call an omnivore. They have a diverse diet. They'll eat just about anything that will give them nutrition. So a lot of vegetation. And if we look at areas where black bears and grizzly bears overlap, the grizzly bears tend to eat more protein from animal sources. So this can be fish or small mammals, or even in some places large mammals. Certainly the calves of deer and elk and moose are very commonly taken by grizzly bears. Polar bears, on the extreme though, are the most carnivorous of the bears. So they evolved basically as a carnivore. They gave up eating vegetation and moved out onto the sea ice. And the reason it works for a polar bear to live on the sea ice, when they catch a seal, they have access to an incredibly rich energy source. And it's not really the meat that they want, it's the blubber that they want. And that's what really makes those bears tick. So they're different across the board, and they have very different, of course, geographic distributions. Black bears still have a pretty broad distribution in North America. Grizzly bears, of course, have a much truncated distribution. Their range shrunk partly because they're a lot more aggressive and cause some issues for humans. So we killed a lot of the bears. So if you look at California, on the state flag, of course, they have a grizzly bear. Well, there's no grizzly bears in California anymore. They actually used to go as far south as Mexico. And globally, grizzly bears have a huge geographic range. So throughout Eurasia, and they actually get down into parts of India and parts of the Middle East as well. Historically, they actually made it onto the northern parts of Africa as well. So bears have this broad geographic distribution. And about the only place that really doesn't have much for bears is Africa and of course Antarctica and Australia. But pretty much everywhere else there's at least one species of bear.
So can I drill down on bear cubs for a minute? Bear cubs are pretty small. Mom comes out of the den and starts moving around with these very small cubs, and sometimes in some bear species like sloth bears, those cubs are almost always riding their mom's backs, and in other cases they aren't. Can you talk about kind of mother-cub relationships, how long the cubs stay with their moms through these different species, and why would they be riding on their mom's backs? And for either one of you.
Sure, go ahead.
So when cubs are born, they're incredibly small. They're what we call altricial, which means that they are completely dependent on their mothers for everything. They are typically with very, very little hair. They certainly can't walk. Their eyes are closed. And so life in the den, even for a tropical bear species, is an extremely important part of cub development. So when the cub is ready to leave the den with the mom, depending on which bear species we're talking about, the environment outside the den, of course, is no longer that safe, thermally regulated place. And some elements in the environment can be challenging for cubs to navigate. They can get tired certainly much easier than their mothers can. And also they can get cold. And Andy can describe what happens up here with polar bears sometimes when the mother needs to navigate through water and how they behave with their cubs.
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned the idea of polar bears carrying, or bears carrying their offspring on their back, and we certainly see that in polar bears. Usually, just south of us, we're into a denning area, and in the springtime, when mothers are leaving, the snow is piled deep in the trees. There's these very small boreal forest trees down there, and the snow all accumulates, and it's like this. It can be hugely deep, and the cubs have a really hard time getting out. And so, what happens quite often is going through. The mother plows a trail and the cubs hop along behind, but if they get tired, she just slows down. The cubs climb up on her back and hold on. So it's something you see in all bear species. The mother bears really don't want to take small cubs into the water, but if they do, they quite often let the cubs ride up on top of her back to keep them as dry as she possibly can. But that's an interesting behavior. I know it's pretty common in sloth bears as well.
Right. In sloth bears, it has a different function. In sloth bear habitat, there are a lot of snakes that can be very dangerous to a cub, and for an adult sloth bear, the very thick fur protects them from any number of animals that could hurt them, but cubs don't have that luxury. So a mother sloth bear will carry cubs, sometimes both cubs, on her back as she navigates her landscape, and it's really an amazing sight to see. For giant pandas, they don't carry cubs on their back as they leave the den, but also the mother, when the cubs are really young and they're still in the den, the mother has to keep that cub off the ground at all times because it's very cold at the time or relatively cold for a cub with very little fur. So that type of maternal care behavior again is very tuned to the different environments that the bears inhabit.
Thank you for that. I'd like to remind everybody that if you'd like to send us questions, you can email those questions to questions@pbears.org, or send Twitter to #TundraConnections, and just ask us a question if you have them. I know we had a lot. I'd like to turn now to Dr. Bitts, and Dr. Bitts, can you tell us a little bit about current climate science, the rate of global warming, and where it's kind of greatest and least?
The current rate of global warming is about 0.8 of a degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So about the last 150 years, and that's about 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit if you're in these states. That may be easier for you to understand. And then if we look more carefully at the spatial pattern, a global map of the temperature change, we'd see where it warms the most, and it's warmed the most in the Arctic. And this somewhat reflects the seasonality too. The seasonality is largest in the Arctic. Bears and species in the Arctic are adapted already to a large temperature range, so they might be able to tolerate a larger temperature change. However, we'll talk a little bit more about polar bears because it's not just temperature it's the impacts of temperature that matter most for polar bears. The Antarctic is a little anomalous in the sense that it has warmed a little bit less than we expect, and less than the Arctic for sure, and that is an area of active research. there aren't any bears there, so I think we'll just skip that story for today. One thing you also notice is that the land has warmed more than the ocean, and that's a uniform feature across the planet. Well, we
Okay.
also
And so sometimes we talk about how weather changes,
Right.
and it's because of like El Nino or La Nina, and and I know that that's kind of cyclical through time. What's the difference between El Nino and climate change
right.
on a global scale?
Well, El Nino has the largest climatic variability imprint on the globe. It's the largest in magnitude and the largest spatially, and it's a cyclic phenomenon. It occurs about every 3 to 4 years. Can occur every other year. And sometimes we even have sequential years in a row that are strong El Nino. But that is not clearly changing from global warming. There have been some papers that argue it's changing one way and changing another, so we're not sure. And it's really kind of in the realm of still some questions we're studying. But it's important to understand its global impact nonetheless. Just the natural cycle is one of drying in Southwest Asia, and it's a wetting in the tropical Central Pacific, which probably isn't as important as the land-based impacts. And that occurs with strong El Ninos, and then there's also a typical warming and drying across the the Pacific Northwest and Western Canada and South Alaska. There are many other impacts, but I think those are some of the most important probably for bears.
So I guess in terms of extremes and kind of expected impacts on the habitat, then where it's going to be wetter, then we'd expect the habitat to change to wetter species. Where it's going to be drier, we'd expect desertification or changes to kind of a drier species complex.
That's right, and changes to the vegetation, which will have impacts on the food availability for species. One of the really interesting studies that came out a few years ago argued that the fitness of animals in the higher latitude was over a narrower range of temperature that they were at their peak. So you can see that it's like an animal walking up a hill. If they're on the uphill side and the temperature warms, they would rise higher on the hill of success. But if they're on the downhill side and the temperature warms, their fitness decreases, and you'd expect that population to decrease. And that seems to be the case for species in the tropics today, that they're more in the center part of their fitness curve, and so warming is a detriment. Whereas in the higher latitudes, it's a broader distribution, again, because animals have adapted to larger seasonality and larger climate variability as well. And they tend to be on the uphill slope. That's not the case for polar bears, because they're not reflecting the temperature change so much as the changes to sea ice.
Fascinating. So, Dr. Owen, Dr. DeRoche, what does this mean for the world's bears?
I think as Cecilia was talking about changes in Southeast Asia and the tropics, we have to realize that these bears are confronted with numerous other problems because of human activities. So these bears are already under just enormous pressure from deforestation, from the illegal wildlife trade, from human encroachment into formerly uninhabited areas. And so what climate change is doing is in disrupting some of the cycles, the timing of food availability, it's amplifying the impacts of human degradation and habitat loss. These are real concerns for conservationists, because as the dry season gets drier, some of the forest fires that are started for forest clearing can have profound impacts beyond where they would have normally. So the scope of human activities is greater, and the impacts can be more profound.
I think one of the really important things from the perspective of all bears, and we've touched on it, is habitat loss is a common feature that is facing pretty much all the species. It doesn't matter which one we're talking about. And one of the challenges that we've got is that as the global population of humans increases, we are converting more areas into agriculture, or we're pushing into forested habitats to cut down trees. And cumulatively, we're taking away habitats that the bears would have used. And the challenge is that as the climate shifts, a lot of these species don't have the options of going to places that they might have gone in a wetter year or a drier year to look for food resources, just because it's no longer habitat at all for them. And it's something pretty common to us in North America that we can see the effects of weather in the short term on things like berry production. Most of us that live around black bears know if there's a really bad berry crop, it's going to be a really bad year for problem bears that come around farms and towns looking for garbage. And it's the same thing we get here in Churchill with the polar bears. Now, we see them on land around us here in Churchill right now, but this is not really where they want to be. They want to be out on the sea ice hunting seals. But one of the challenges is that the longer they spend on land here, they can't get to their primary habitat, and of course there's not much for them to eat on land, and what we get is hungry bears, and hungry bears are problem bears. And we've got the town of Churchill right close to us, and then further north, when the bears start walking on this migration, they end up in the town of Arviat, causing a lot more problems there. So it's a risk factor both for the bears and for people, and so it's a challenge, and it's surprising how many people are scared of bears. It's not very likely that you're going to be attacked, but it does happen, and it has happened in Churchill recently. And interestingly, one of probably the most aggressive bears is actually the sloth bear. There's far more people injured in India by sloth bears than we would see in 2 or 3 decades of injuries in North America from black bears or grizzly bears. They're really they're small, but
Yeah, and a lot of that also comes from a historic overlap of human populations and bears, because bears have been persecuted for centuries by humans, and there is learning that happens with bears, and when you learn to fear a human because you might be poached or attacked, you will respond with aggression. So there are tremendous challenges anytime human populations and bears overlap in their range. Another thing, when we think about habitat and what bears need, we often think of habitat in terms of space, but habitat really is defined by the resources that those bears need. And I think a great example of that in a changing climate is the giant panda, because over the last 50 years, we've really been working very hard towards giant panda conservation. They're critically endangered, but the population is increasing, and we've really been dedicating a tremendous amount of multidisciplinary energy towards panda conservation. There are many reserves in China now designated for pandas, and these reserves were chosen because of the bamboo resources in them and the ideal habitat for giant panda. Well, climate change is going to change all that, because pandas rely on bamboo. Just like a polar bear needs sea ice, a giant panda needs bamboo. It can't survive as a giant panda on any other food source. And in many of the reserves in China, the predictions over the next 50 years are that the bamboo will no longer be there. So what happens when you've set aside a reserve, but it no longer contains that resource that animal needs? It's a huge challenge for conservation and for bears worldwide.
I'll just note that that's a common issue in a lot of areas. So if you look at the park system in North America, very often we preserve these areas that were just beautiful to look at, but in reality they just weren't very good bear habitats. So if you look at the Rocky Mountains, we've got lots of these parks that protect these nice big peaks that are wonderful to climb and hike in. But the challenge is that's not where the bears want to be. They want to go up there just for a very short window of time in their annual cycle. Where they really want to be is down in the river valley bottoms and in the foothills, where there was lots of productivity. And of course, in a lot of those areas, they would have been out there looking for bison calves, at least hundreds of years ago when we had bison in those areas. So we change these ecosystems and we keep pushing the animals back, and we say, well, we've got all these big parks, isn't that wonderful? But then we start to look at them and they're really little postage stamps, and now we have to try to connect them all together. And there's some good news, and we're seeing positive actions in many parts of the world to set aside parks and to make sure they're connected to other areas. That works well for terrestrial bears. It doesn't work well for polar bears because, well, we're just on the edge of a national park, but that national park can't do anything about protecting sea ice as a habitat, and sea ice is disappearing. And I don't know if Dr. Bitts is going to talk about that a bit or not.
If there's a question, I'd be happy to.
Why don't you talk about that a little bit, and then we'll go back to some questions about bear denning habits?
We've had excellent images of sea ice from satellites since 1979, so we have a good understanding of the history of sea ice for the last 35 years. And it's declined in summertime in particular, and in September at the most, by about 45% or so since the beginning of the satellite history. And it's particularly declined from the coastal margins, so the regions where it used to cover the continental slope for most of summer, are the places it's retreated the most. And that's, of course, the most rich in marine biological productivity, and that's where fish and seals are the most, inhabit the most, and so these are big problems for polar bears, even at this point, and the future projections are that we'll have no sea ice in September in about the next 30 to 40 years.
Thanks. Disturbing. We have a couple of questions that overlap, and I think these are for Dr. DeRoche. MK asks, how is climate change affecting the polar bear reproductive system and denning habits? And maybe we could talk about habitat there also as it relates to this sea ice loss. And Mrs. King's class asks, what adaptations have polar bears made that make them different from grizzlies? Could they go back to living on land?
Well, they're two pretty different questions. So let's talk about the reproductive system of the bears. And bears have a pretty neat setup. They're not like humans when it comes to reproduction. So the mating occurs in the springtime for most of the species, at least in North America. They mate in the springtime, and then the eggs are fertilized, but then they develop just to a very small state, and then they just stop at that phase, and it's what we call delayed implantation. So normally in other mammals you would just keep the development going, but polar bears have this diapause that we call it, and what they do is they just sort of stop development of the young, and then it's not until the fall, sort of right about September for polar bears, that the developing young implant into the uterus and then start developing. And they're only about 60 days of active gestation inside the mother, growing, and that's why when polar bear cubs are born, I mean, they're like the size of a big guinea pig. They're really small, and 60 days is about the size or duration of a dog in terms of reproduction. But it's a neat strategy. What we're not sure about is how it's changing relative to climate change, and we don't know how much flexibility there might be. We're pretty sure that the breeding has to occur in the spring, but can the mothers change when those young start developing? Because with earlier breakup of the sea ice in the springtime, there would be advantages for females to perhaps implant their young a little bit earlier and give birth a little bit earlier, so you could get out onto the sea ice a little bit sooner. And we do see variation in polar bear reproductive ecology depending on what latitude we're at. So they have obviously some flexibility to change what they do, but we don't have a good understanding whether or not they can change fast enough to sort of keep ahead with the loss of sea ice. So that's going to be the big challenge going forward. It's a great system. It works great for bears, and it works well partly because they also are denning during these periods of time when they're young or developing. So there's a lot of interesting physiology that goes on. If you think about most mammals, they're eating all the time while they're pregnant, but for polar bears and black bears and grizzly bears, there's no food coming into the mother during that whole period of active gestation. So it's some amazingly interesting things that these bears can do, and it's quite a challenge to know how they're going to respond to changing climate. But it's a very difficult thing to study because, of course, the bears are in dens. We don't want to disturb them when they're in such a sensitive environment.
Are the den sites changing? That's what I was focusing on, was kind of the land-based dens, and how they might be maybe melting.
Well, we are seeing
warming?
some changes in the distribution of denning areas. So one of the things, when I worked in the Norwegian Arctic, we used to work on a small island, and basically the females had to get there about October, November, so they could dig a den into the snow and get settled in. But now there's not enough sea ice, so they can't actually get to that area anymore. And there's no females denning in that part of the world anymore. And then off the coast of Alaska, it used to be that about 2/3 of the bears the females would actually den over winter out on the sea ice and give birth to their cubs on the sea ice. The sea ice there is so unstable now that the whole pattern has shifted. Now about 2/3 of the females are giving birth on land. So we're seeing some behavioral plasticity. That means that animals have behaviors that they can modify. It's not evolution, it's just already sort of tricks that they have, or traits that they have that they can apply to different situations. It's not evolution, it doesn't occur in that window of time. Now I think the next question was about terrestrial foods, is that correct?
Well, adaptations that polar bears have that make them different from grizzlies, and could the polar bears go back to living
Yeah.
on land? And then a question just came in from Pittsburgh Zoo and PPG Aquarium. Have hybrids always occurred, or is it more common now because habitats are being pushed close together? So,
Well, it's interesting. We know that grizzly bears and polar bears are dramatically different. We've got claws of a polar bear and a grizzly bear here in front of us. I'll just hold them up. I mean, you can see this is a grizzly bear claw, and that's basically, it's a digging tool. It's designed for digging for roots. It's for pulling down branches to pull berries off. You can't climb trees with this, and of course black bears have different claws yet again. So you see adaptations like that, but this is a polar bear claw, and I mean it looks much more cat-like. They can't retract them like cats can, but this is a sharp tool. It's for basically gripping slippery prey that are trying to get away. What are their prey? Well, they're seals. Seals are really slick and hard to catch, and of course they don't want to be eaten. But if you've got a piece of equipment like this, you can grab on, hold on to them, get a bite, and then you've got your meal. So there's vastly different adaptations between grizzly bears and polar bears. It's interesting when you get right down to the structure of their teeth. They're different. Grizzly bears are going to a more omnivore type teeth, so their back teeth and the molars are more designed for grinding vegetation. Polar bear teeth in the molars are moving back to a more carnivorous state, and they're actually more like meat shearing teeth, so they're designed for cutting meat so you can swallow it. There's changes in the skull structure, and what we see is actually grizzly bears have stronger skulls than polar bears, and that's because if you're going to grind away on vegetation, you really have to be able to masticate it, really chew it up to get the nutrients out. Polar bears don't really have to deal with that. If you catch a seal, you just need to rip it open, and then you typically eat the blubber that's inside. So you're not eating anything that hard or difficult to process. There's a lot of other adaptations. It's kind of interesting because if you go out into the north right now, you can't find a grizzly bear anywhere in the Arctic because they've already gone into den. They go into den about the beginning of November, and they've all gone to sleep for the winter. And it's the winter when polar bears really make their living. So they're both Arctic species, but they live totally different lives. And as I mentioned, we do have hybrids in the wild right now. When I was in the high Arctic this last spring, we caught a bear that we think is probably a 3/4 grizzly bear, 1/4 polar bear. We're not sure yet. We have to do the genetics on them. But we know of many hybrid bears in the Canadian Arctic right now. We just pulled up a picture. This was a bear I caught this spring. This is when I saw him last year. I couldn't catch him last year. The weather was, despite it looks nice, but it was getting too late and too far away. We caught him this year, and he was pretty clearly looking a lot like a grizzly bear. And I think we're just going to pull him up on the screen here. And we're seeing a lot just in this one area where we're seeing these hybrids, and we're not really sure how long it's been going on. The Inuit that live in that area don't have a word for a hybrid bear, so it's probably new in their culture, but it has happened in the past. We know that during a colder period, polar bears came much further south, and they actually bumped into brown bears or grizzly bears in Northern Ireland. And we know that there was some genetic exchange between the species there. We know it's also happened off the coast of Alaska as well, where it looks like polar bears came down and settled on some of the islands, what we call the ABC Islands there, Admiralty, Bishnikov, and Chichikov Islands, and the polar bears appeared to be down there. And then what happened is when the ice retreated, some of the bears sort of got stuck there, but then they got flooded by grizzly bear genes coming from the mainland, and so now they're pretty much all grizzly bear, but there are some remnant genes from polar bears. So it's a complicated story, and we are probably going to rewrite the history of polar bears again and again as we get better tools and more insights into their structure.
Thank you. We have a question from the SeaWorld San Diego Wild Arctic team. Do you see a change in gestational time period based on where bears den? And I think we'll go with that, and then I'll go with the next question.
We don't think so. I mean, it's pretty standard, I think, right from bears in zoos. The gestation period seems to be pretty much about the same. We don't have good information in wild populations, but what we do know is that there are different set points, like probably set by day length and photo period, that are probably entrained in their physiology. But in this population, females with cubs will leave their dens. When the cubs are they have to get about 10 kilos, so about 22 pounds, and that's when they start heading back to the sea ice. In this area, they'll leave probably about the last week of February up to about the middle of March. But if you go up into the Beaufort Sea, so if you're up in Alaska, it would be much more likely to see them coming out of their dens latter part of March into the middle part of April. So there's a temporal shift in that sense. We don't have any good data to suggest that there's big changes going on. What we do suspect in this population is that the timing of bear mothers leaving their dens has actually crept a little bit earlier. So they're leaving a bit sooner than they used to. So there's a suggestion of some flexibility, but we don't know why. And it could be that the mothers, because they're losing body condition, because they're losing access to the sea ice, and they're not as fat as they used to be, it just might be that they don't have the option to stay in their dens longer. That they really have a set point for body weight that means I have to leave. And if that means I have to leave with my cubs being younger or less ready to be out on the ice, that's just the risk I have to take, because the whole strategy about female polar bears and reproduction is, if I can't rear this litter, I'm going to live to raise another litter. So they start reproducing about 4 years of age, first mating at that age, and then they can actually keep producing cubs in this area right up till they're at least about 28 years in the wild. So you've got lots of opportunities to be successful with raising cubs.
I will say, I think we know more about bears in dens because of zoo studies where we have cameras in the denning areas than we do about maybe bears in dens out in the wild. We know that, for instance, pandas break their water before they give birth, just like humans do. But that was only because we had HD cameras on those pandas before they gave birth. Of course, the Chinese knew long before we knew with our technology. That's another story. So Dr. Owen, I do have one that maybe you could answer, and that is, why do bears not have hair when they're born?
If we can think about the den as sort of an extension of the gestational period, sort of like in marsupials. So as we mentioned before, bear cubs across the bear family are highly altricial. Andy had just said that polar bears probably truly gestate for about 60 days. A giant panda, it's probably shorter at about 50 days. Giant pandas are the most altricial of all bear cubs when they're born. And during that period, the mother takes just intensive care of these cubs, again, across bear species. And we don't know why they're born so altricial. In the case of the giant panda, most people know that pandas rely exclusively on bamboo for their energy and for their nutrition. It's an incredibly low, very poor energy source. And so there are hypotheses that the mother has a better chance at providing sustenance to their offspring outside the uterus, so providing milk for their cubs as opposed to nutrition through the placenta. So hairless, closed eyes, completely dependent, completely consistent across the bear family, and we don't know why, but we have lots of ideas.
Thank you. Another question from SeaWorld San Diego Wild Arctic team, which is, really full of good observers. They said, looking at the body mass index card, which is right there, Andy, you can have it. Are you seeing bears here in Churchill with generally good weight on them?
This is an interesting chart. It's kind of a useful thing, and you sort of think, well, you just rank a bear from 1 to 5. We actually use something very much like this when we catch a bear, and we have it immobilized. And what we do is we basically do an independent assessment. We sort of, do this 1, 2, 3, and then you hold up how many fingers, and you say, okay, it's a 2, and everybody agrees it's a 2, but you've also palpated along the spine and around the hips to sort of see just how fat they are. It's a useful technique of sort of getting a qualitative assessment, and it's interesting. We've tried a lot more fancy methods to try to estimate body condition. We can use bioimpedance, where you put little electrodes on to see how much current flows through them. We can weigh them. In reality, most of the things that happen, it's sort of broad scale, and this qualitative index actually works surprisingly well for understanding the ecology of the bears. In zoos, where you've got a lot closer access, there's probably a lot better ways to do it. It's very invasive to weigh every bear. You have to carry a lot of equipment, or you have to suspend them, and that's not usually a good thing for bears. So it's probably one of the better things we've got. It's pretty easy. When we see bears walking around, you can pick out pretty quickly that bear's in good shape and that bear's really not doing well, and that one looks like it's a walking skeleton. So it's you can pick it up pretty quick.
I would say that now, compared to 10 years ago, we're seeing more bears that are a little bit on the thin side.
Yeah, it's hard to say with just that sort of information. That's why when we catch bears and we do a sampling protocol, we take all these measurements of chest girth and length and head size, and so we can monitor the growth of individuals. One of the other things here is that, again, when we're looking at bears on the migration, we have a very different perspective of the population as a whole. So the bears that are really doing poorly, they're not the ones that are going to try to migrate north. They're just going to sit still and hopefully wait out the ice-free period and then head out on the ice. They're not going to be very active. They're not going to be moving very much. They're not going to be the ones that we see from the tundra buggies play fighting and sparring. So there's a lot of difference. Some years you can see mothers with cubs around where the cubs are definitely very lethargic, not doing well, and probably aren't going to survive to make it out onto the sea ice. And we have had documented cases of bears starving on land. Bears have always starved at this time of year, but one of our concerns is that as the ice-free period gets longer and longer, more bears are going to be into that I don't have enough energy to survive the ice-free period state, and that's where we're really at risk in the population perspective. Your average bear and fatter is probably going to do okay, but the problem is the average is slipping lower and lower every year, and that's one of the concerns. So we are seeing a lot of bears that aren't doing that well.
Thank you. We just had a question from Pittsburgh Zoo and PPG Aquarium. Were polar bears around during the last ice age? And that just reminds me, Dr. Bitts, maybe you could talk a little bit about how really the Earth isn't supposed to be warming right now based on the historic cycles, but we're supposed to be kind of going back toward an ice age. Is that correct?
Yes. We've always had ice ages for the last 40 million years or so, so that's well recorded in the paleoclimate history of the planet. And in the last million years or so, they've occurred about every 100,000 years, so we've had 10. And these periods in between are called interglacial, so we're currently in an interglacial. And they tend to last around 10,000 years. They can be longer. But at this point, based on the configuration of the planets around the sun, we think that we should be going towards an ice age. Slowly, but it would be, not something that you'd expect to occur in this, century, but 1,000-year time scales. But now that we've been increasing greenhouse gas levels to the extent we have right now, we've increased our greenhouse gas of carbon dioxide by about 30 to 40% over the pre-industrial level. We're in control, and we won't be expecting an ice age to occur as long as the greenhouse gases are that high.
And Dr. DeRoche, were they around during these cycles?
They were. It's interesting because where we are right now, if we just rolled back the clock 10,000 years into the last ice age here, we would not have had any polar bears anywhere near us here because, of course, we would have
ice as far as we could see.
ice as far as we could see. It would have been a mile high above us. So there would have been a lot of ice here, and of course, as the sea ice retreated, it sort of moved off to the north, and it created what was called actually at the time the Tyrrell Sea in this area. But eventually, polar bears came back into this area, and where they were during the last ice age, we're not entirely sure, but we do know some of the places where they were, and they were further south. So during colder periods in the history of polar bears, they definitely moved south. My guess is that they were probably all along the coast of Labrador or Newfoundland, probably down into the northern states. Certainly in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, they would have had probably things to eat there. We know also from good fossil records that they were in the southern parts of Sweden, probably got into the Baltic Sea, and all throughout that area. And we also know, of course, at various times that they got into the United Kingdom. So during cold periods, they got pushed south, and this is why we're so concerned with warming, is we know what happens when the planet warms in a natural condition is that polar bears retreat northward. And all the sea ice projections right now say that we're going to lose a lot of the sea ice, probably about 2/3 of the habitat of polar bears, meaning that the only habitat that's going to be left is going to be left at very high latitudes. That also always brings up the question, well, wasn't it warmer in the past, and so therefore how did polar bears deal with that? Well, polar bears are a relatively new species in an evolutionary context, but yes, they did see warmer periods in the past, and they sometimes occurred quite quickly. But the interesting thing is we don't really know what the sea ice looked like during those periods. So we have good records of what the climate would have been like at lower temperate latitudes because we have good climatological records to examine, but we don't know what the sea ice looked like. It's quite likely, though, that polar bears went through a retraction and moved into smaller areas. Then when the climate got cold again, they expanded back out. The problem is it's not going to get cold again under the current levels of carbon dioxide we've got in the atmosphere. We're not going to see another ice age, so there's never going to be an expansion, and we're only going to see a directional contraction. And it's really up to humans to decide how big that contraction is going to be, and that's our decision based on carbon use and trajectories.
Well, I have one more question before we go to potential climate actions that you can take. And I'm going to lead in by saying Polar Bears International and the AZA Bear Advisory Group and the IUCN Bear Specialist Group have had a kind of a historic working relationship that helped to integrate research questions. So the question from Pittsburgh Zoo and PPG Aquarium team is, what critical questions can zoos help address through our progressive care and training programs for bears, polar bears, and other bears?
Well, that's a great question. And I think that the first answer to that is to use us as a resource. Please, contact the Bear Tag or Polar Bears International. And there are a number of questions that can really be best addressed with captive animals, so in a zoological setting. And there are a number of really important critical questions regarding energetics and metabolism that we can get at some of the details of how bears metabolize certain foods if we can study them on a daily basis, collect samples non-invasively, voluntarily, on a daily basis or at some regular intervals. So that's one way that can really enhance what field biologists are learning about polar bears. There are also studies in behavior that also can enhance our understanding of polar bears and how they navigate in their ecosystem. We've been doing studies on polar bear communication, and these are things that we will continue to do. Polar bears are not very vocal species. The cubs are vocal, but the adults are not, and we feel that polar bears communicate most efficiently through scent, and we have ongoing programs looking at how polar bears use scent to communicate, and this will become increasingly important as the ice fracturing because of climate change intensifies. Also, when we've been talking a lot about mothers and cubs and polar bear reproduction, there is a lot we don't know about polar bear reproduction, and again, this is something that could really be enhanced by zoo-based research. We'd like to know some more details about what's going on in a maternal den, and by instrumenting a den in a zoo, we can find out what's going on there between mother and cub, how much communication goes back and forth, and how sensitive mother and cubs are to what's going on outside the den. But the best place to get this information is by contacting us, and we really hope to be hearing from you.
That's great. Thanks. Well, Polar Bears International's goal is to keep polar bears in the Arctic always. It's important to remember that time remains for saving polar bears and their sea ice habitat, and we can all do our part to make this happen. And I'm going to extend that to all bears and say that we have to conserve all habitats on the planet. So wherever you are today, you can take local action. Thank you for the things you're already doing, like lowering your thermostat, riding your bike, reducing your electronic device time, and increasing your outdoor time. You can vote. I hope you all voted if you're adults. Your family's money votes at the stores, and you can vote for policy leaders at the ballot box that support climate change action and support conservation on the planet. And all of these everyday actions help to save bears. So there are other things that you can do. Dr. Rowan, would you like to say a couple of things that people can do?
Absolutely. My favorite thing to tell people to do is turn off your devices, go outside. If you're an adult, go outside, ride your bike, take a walk, find an alternative means to get to work. If you're a kid or a playful adult, go outside and play, and just take in what's outside your doors and stop staring at a screen once our broadcast is over.
Dr. DeRoche?
I think for us in our family, I mean, we're shifting over all of our light fixtures. So we're moving to either compact fluorescence or diode type fixtures. So we can greatly reduce the amount of electricity that we use. We are, of course, in my family, acutely aware of the factor that using energy is affecting polar bears. So we really cut down and we consciously turn off lights. We have nice big windows in our house and we keep them open, and we don't have air conditioning, even though in Edmonton it gets pretty warm in the summer, but we don't have air conditioning. I have no interest in it. I know it's nice to have, but of course people have gone for long periods of time in human history without having air conditioning. So there's different things. I think that we really have to start looking at how we use our resources more wisely. We use public transit a lot. I walk to work every day. I'm fortunate that I could afford a house and bought a house near the university, so I walk to work. And so I can go for weeks without having to be in a vehicle. It's kind of nice.
Dr. Bitts, last words?
I like to encourage young people especially to consider being a scientist or a mathematician or an engineer, to apply your creativity and talents to developing technological solutions like new devices that can reduce our energy dependency and greener energy solutions. And math and science is fun, so there's great side effects, like maybe you'll get to come to a really beautiful place like this and watch the polar bears while they still live. Yeah.
And I'll say, just please think about the foods that you eat, use your local farm stands, and think about your carbon footprint on the planet. Thanks for joining us today. We'd like to thank Julian Reed, an Apple Distinguished Educator and PBI Education Advisory Council member who directs the PBI Tundra Connections program, to our platinum sponsor, Frontiers North Tundra Buggy Adventure. Again, we're on Tundra Buggy number 1 here. Canada Goose, which supports our parkas. Support has also been provided by Pearls of the Planet, a project of Explore.org, a direct charitable activity of the Annenberg Foundation. We're also grateful to Telestream, makers of Wirecast, Parks Canada, Discovery Education, the Center for Global Education, and Taking IT Global. Thanks for being with us today. Join us for our chats today and tomorrow as well. Bye now.